I'm Charles Wardman. I'm the Director of Cyber and Managed Service Provision here at Croft, and I'm responsible for the data security and integrity across our infrastructure and our clients. I've been involved in tech since my teens, and along with the team at Croft, have been involved and down in the trenches with our clients while we've responded to cyber incidents. We have learned a lot from that experience and continue to build better processes and services to better protect the teams and the people that we support. In doing this, we've built a reputation for top-tier service driven by procedure, process and systems alignment. The reference material for what I'm going to fire through now is from Panda Labs, the National Cyber Security Centre, Detica's report to the Cabinet Office on the cost of cybercrime, and the Association of British Insurers, complemented by Mandiant and FireEye. I mentioned that so that you've got some idea of the provenance and pedigree of the reference data that I'm using, so you can have high confidence in that. Today, it's going to be a broad update on the targets, values and trends for 2022 and hopefully trigger a lot of questions. The session for me is about sharing knowledge and priming you for those questions at the end. So anything you come up with, let Cassie know or put your hand up at the end, and I'm hoping to have a bit of time to chat about what we're going to be doing. So the first thing to talk about for 2022, and this isn't terribly unusual in the industry, but we're going to start with the top fives. So businesses tend to think that cyber attacks and cyber warfare is about a nation state hitting nation state. It does happen, but as you'd imagine, those are pretty hard targets. And you see that reflected in some of the commercial values that I'll go on to in one of the later slides. Businesses, by contrast, are typically in the top 5 categories now in each sector. They are in here year on year. So while businesses this year are the top target, they were number 4 in 2019, number 2 in 2018, and so on. They never make it out of the top 5. This is principally because businesses are easy, fat targets who rarely respond to the sign of intrusion. The trends that we're seeing forming, we've got this evolution in ransomware. So like every industry, each year brings new changes or an approach to those changes. Ransomware has now evolved into a multifaceted extortion where actors don't only deploy ransomware encryptors across the victim's environments, but also employ a variety of other extortion tactics to coerce people into complying with their demands. Shorthand, it's no longer just about messing up your files, but it's how bad actors can actually threaten and extort your staff in order to increase the odds of success. Another trend this year is that as that ransomware has increased both in reach and effectiveness, it's actually brought down dwell time. Dwell time I will go on to, so don't worry about that. What this means is that we're seeing more smash and grab than before. So rather than entering a network and diligently finding targets, we see a lot of straight to terminal attacks. So if somebody comes into the network and then they just take you out, no questions asked. Lastly, it was fairly inevitable, but threat actors have taken advantage of the infrastructure supporting work at home with an increased focus on vulnerability exploitation. So it's easier to get your kid's laptop or your Nest thermostat than it is to target your company firewall. And then lastly, there's some stats at the bottom. These are from the Association of British Insurers. The average value on a claim for an attack is now £8,000, it's £24,000 for corporates, and I think £7,500 for small businesses. And 43% of businesses are claiming on a monthly basis. That's not different, but it's a different business ruling. What we've got on the next slides here is a cabinet briefing on the structure of cybercrime. Now, this is to go some way to demonstrating the level of industry that's now involved here. With people being at home, criminal activity, it's quite difficult to burgle people. So use your money, your resources and your ties to invest. And I'll come on to here, but ransomware as a service has become a thing as a result. What you're looking at here in this graph is charting everything out. So typically you would see an individual criminal who's coming in, they're motivated, they've got some money and they've got skill, and they'll engage in sort of reasonably mundane attacks, espionage, data theft and online theft. Whereas what we're seeing more of now is the bottom left of this diagram is organised crime. Now they've got great capability, reputation in the space and huge profits to put at it. I won't go into the detail in this, but suffice to say that using that combination of the individual skilled in attacking with the resource of organised crime has made a significant impact on what we're seeing. So that leads to this market insights. So this is the average value in 2020 of resold access to a breached network. So what you'll see here is technology, for instance, up at $32,000, energy and industrial at $48,000, and I mentioned government here at only $2,200. Governments are hard targets, they are, once they're in, they respond quickly with good process and diligence, and they tend to get you out. It's not worth going into a government. It's far more valuable in terms of a return on investment to go after, for instance, a legal or an HR firm, because you can resell that access. You don't need to do anything when you're in. You can simply just advertise, look, I've got myself into HR company consultant one, anybody want in, and you can make yourself a quick $85,000 for doing it. The price you see to the right globally is the average price of resold stolen personal information. So get into a network, pull that information out, and each time you sell it over in Africa, you're going to make $28 a go. As this is to give some illustration as to the scale of the economics that are working here, and what it goes some way to helping you get an understanding of risk. I mentioned dwell time earlier. This has been an interesting shift. Dwell is the amount of time between you and a successful attack, so penetration into a network, and you being aware of that. And globally, dwell time has decreased in this reporting to 24 days, but in EMA, it actually increased, so Europe, Middle East and Asia, from 54 days to 66 days. It's a horrifying figure, this. I will go into a bit more detail. 3% of attacks are still over 700 days. So somebody's been in your network for the better part of 2 years before you know about it. But that shouldn't in any way diminish the 66 days being at nearly 2 months. The other part of this that's really interesting is that external notifications, so this is people outside your network and outside your organization telling you that you've been breached, continue to exceed internal notifications. It's still very much the case that businesses are worse at identifying their own attacks or their own vulnerabilities than the people around them. And it's something, while it has improved, it needs to move further. The other part of this is that we're starting to see more and more freely available tools online used in attacks. So it's gone from 19 to 22%. What that means is that you can now type things. I won't tell you what things, but you can type things into Google, you'll get a web shop, you can go online and download something for free, type in somebody's domain name, and that tool, not an individual, will go away and try and attack that network for you. What we have seen on a positive is that ransomware investigation has gone up from 14 to 25%, but what this tells you, it's still the case that organizations will only investigate 1 in 4 ransomware activities, ignoring 75% of them. Dwell time and impact. Those slides lead to this. So what will happen during an attack and you being aware of it? So during this time, a bad actor or their software is going to be working to identify targets of opportunity, flaws and features that can be exploited, and user behaviors. And all of these are going to work together to achieve their goals. User behavior is increasingly interesting to bad actors as it facilitates extortion and exploitation. A very good example of this was in 2021, as people started moving home, and we saw a bit of it earlier than that. You would get an email saying, so 2 pieces of information were stolen. Somebody would have found a password that had been used historically in what we call a scrape, which is a publicly available list of stolen passwords from historic attempts. Now, legitimate tools use those in order to tell you you've reused your password too many times. The significance of the password was a validator. So you would get an email saying, I have caught you watching pornographic content on your laptop, and we have switched the camera on and filmed you. As proof of the fact that we have done this, here is your password. Now, in fact, this is just spam. It's a supposition, so a guess that there's a likely percentage of people where this would be an issue, and then given credibility by use of password. That kind of low-hanging exploitation of user has ramped up an awful lot as people have gone home, and it's something that businesses and organizations need to be aware of and mindful to try and protect against. The other thing about dwell time running at 66 days is that you'll often fall back on backups in order to recover your organization. Now, if your backups were infected, then restoring to them won't improve your situation. And dwell time and understanding dwell time is critical in knowing that you can recover your organization from an attack. And if the average is 66 days, you need to be able to go back to 67 days. So you need at least 2 months worth of recoverable data. And critically, you need to be able to operate as a business with everything you would lose during those 66 days. So you'd lose your payroll data, you'd lose your invoicing information, and you'd lose everything else. Now, if you're not able to do that, then you need to seriously look at sort of risk impact, risk assessment. The other thing to note on this slide, well, this slide's been up for you guys a long time now, is what we call APTs. So APTs are advanced persistent threats, or advanced persistent threat groups. And these are groups that work on long cycles, often multi-year, to achieve their goals. So as opposed to what we think of, which is sort of more palatable, is temp groups, which you've got a hacker jumps in, does something, get opportunities, they go away, particularly nation states where they fund these activities. You're talking about people who have a business plan, and they're working out over a 1 or 2 year cycle, not to just get to you, but to get everybody in your supply chain up and down and cause damage. APTs follow an established attack methodology, which I'll actually cover in a later webinar, that was originally defined by Lockheed Martin in the early 2000s, which we refer to as the kill chain. So it's very serious. Not knowing somebody's in your network is a major issue, and the types of organization that exist out there, twinned with the kind of vulnerabilities that people can be exposed to directly because of the amount of information they give out on social media, now creates a situation where we're seeing more and more cybercrime coming into the physical, the real world. So the predictions for 2022. What we are expecting to see is a weaponizing social media to target enterprise professionals with an intention to infiltrate organizations for criminal gain. So I mentioned that a bit earlier. We expect to see nation states increasing their offensive operation. Now, this is not about nation states attacking nation states again. This is about them leveraging cyber criminals, so paying them money in order to attack the whole of the UK, as an example. It is far easier to go and take out 1,000 one-man bands than it is to go and take out a 1,000 employee enterprise, because they're just better resourced. And nation states are aware of this, and that's the kind of guerrilla attacks that they engage with online. Ransomware is shifting. So ransomware as a service. This is not, I am a capable developer building ransomware. This is much like software as a service. It's, we do ransomware, give us an amount of money, and we'll go off and run that project for you, and we'll come back and deliver on the results. If you get into the darknet pages here, these are web pages that are fully thrown up with subscription services, little chat bots, terms and conditions, and you just go online and you put in as much money as you want in order to target the people that you want to target. And going back to those economics earlier, if you're successful and you can get an HR or a legal firm at $84,000, you can sell the access. You don't even need to get your hands dirty. We're seeing a lot more of that. Public tools. So where ransomware is a service, like all sort of commercial enterprises, there's a high level skill set. Some of those people will develop tools to make their lives easier, and those tools will then become freely available or chargeable online, meaning that we can have even more people moving into the ransomware space. And that's why I've seen this sort of massive uptake through the year as a percentage, which is what the graph on the right is. When we went into February 2020, we were seeing 8, 6, 9, 9%. By the time we got to September, we were up to 27% of attacks. 5G and APIs. As we increase the speed of connectivity across the network, we also increase the availability. So it's easy for you to get in, it's easier for the bad guys to get in, and APIs. Businesses are increasingly leaning on integrations between platforms. That layer necessarily adds an opportunity for a bad actor to come in and do something that you wouldn't want them to. We're seeing much more targeting of that. We're seeing line of business applications. So LOB, software dev containers. This is line of business applications and software development containers. This is where business has gone, look, we've got a unique need, we've got something specific to us. We're actually now going to take that step, and we're going to hire software developers to write something for us. Security around that is difficult because it's a unique product, so it's only understood by the developers. You're reliant upon them in order to instigate sort of much of the security around how it operates, and you need to be fully invested in its life cycle. You have to keep it running in the same way that any other application would do. The risk here is interesting because often it's seen as a small project to solve a small problem. But if it's line of business, if it's critical to how you operate and becomes increasingly critical with use, then it massively increases the risk of impact to your business should that application become unavailable. So they're easy targets again, unfortunately. And then we're seeing a lot more 0 day. So 0 day is a vulnerability, either because of a flaw or a feature in a piece of software, or even a user potentially, where you haven't exploited that feature, flaw, or vulnerability. Often you'll find it, basically. You'll find a way in, and then you'll either sell it, and you might sell it to multiple parties. You'll coordinate with multiple parties, but you'll keep it under wraps until an agreed date where you'll hit everybody. What we've seen happen here is that zero-day exploits now, instead of being days and weeks, somebody will find a bug and within hours there'll be massive attacks against that vulnerability. It's quite shocking. So good security in response to that, and I appreciate I'm sort of moving through quite quickly, is about understanding the perimeter. That's the edges that surround your estate. So I tend to equate this to physical security. So if it were your house, your home, connectivity is what's going in and out. It's like the water and the electricity. It's bytes and bits. On top of your connectivity, you're building infrastructure. So this is the foundations of the house. And this is what you do with the water and power in order to get everything in your living space running. It's the plumbing. So for this is firewalls, switches, routers, wireless access points, cabling, some parts of server infrastructure. The next step, which is what you do with that sort of water and power, those bits of infrastructure, is your living space. So productivity tools, TVs, ovens, music systems, everything that makes your home come alive, in the same way that in a business, it's increasingly the software that you run and the software that runs the applications, the machinery that you use, that sort of creates that, you know, there's my analogy, living space. What you then do is wrap security around that. Security, like physical security, is as much or as little as you feel is appropriate to protect where you are. If you live in a small home, you may just have, you know, a doorbell. You might then move up to a burglar alarm. From the burglar alarm, you might decide to have internal sensors. You may choose to have those internal sensors switch a light on in order to illuminate an intruder. You may start introducing facial recognition in order to distinguish between pets, people you know, people you don't know. You might then move to have CCTV, and then so on and so on. Important there is not to just look at the house, it's to go look, like you would with your insurance. I should probably insure all of my property, including when it's on the move. So my car is part of my perimeter. That's analogous to your mobile phone, my tablets, anything that's moving and taking your material somewhere is something that you should consider as part of your security perimeter and that fence that we wrap around it and what we do to protect it. The good one is whether or not you have a bouncer. Most antivirus products still rely on known detection. So we see a detection and we respond to it because we know that's a bad person, which is how a bouncer works. What we want to do instead is have a list of, you are approved to come in, therefore you can run. And that's a fundamental shift that we're seeing in that part of security. Lastly is skills. So this is the experience and resource to respond to a threat of an attack to any of these layers, because each can undermine the other. It is a necessarily complex system. And that's why we build our stack from templates, sort of standardized blocks, because it reduces the amount of time that's in hypothesizing about the cause and effect, and that speeds up client and attack response, which creates a uniform set of variables. It limits the number of things that can change to check against, and it ultimately makes us stronger and faster at responding to issues. And it's that uniformity that's going to be crucial in the years ahead. It's about pulling together the IT and communications estate and acknowledging that security needs to flow from the top of the organization as a risk assessment down the way. So then leads me to sort of questions. So because you've obviously got this significant period of time between an attack getting into your network, and majority of businesses are attacked on a bi-monthly basis, and they're in there for a good period of time, what do you do? So the questions here. So as an organization, how do you know an incident's occurred? So has the board explicitly conveyed the threshold for when it wants to be told about an incident? What monitoring is in place around the critical assets? So personal data is an obvious one. We shouldn't, and I would stress this here, you shouldn't think of personal data as being like the GDPR guidance on personal data. This isn't about the ICO will give me a fine. It's that if I can steal enough of your personal data, I can pretend to be you. And if I can pretend to be you, then you can't really ever get rid of me. And that's important, particularly around critical and non-critical systems. That then leads to, when they're inside and you know that an incident occurred, what is a critical system, what is not a critical system, and how do you prioritize bringing them back online? Who examines the logs, and are they sufficiently trained to identify anomalous activity, things that we wouldn't expect to going through on? What are the thresholds for alert? You know, when's it severe, and how do you determine that? And how confident are you that you know all of the IT assets in your organization? You know, so again, we're going back to how do you know an incident's occurred? Well, you've got to start with knowing where are all the places that that could happen, like your home. Second point, as an organization, what measures do you take to minimize the damage of an attacker? So how do you authenticate and grant access to users? Do you just say, look, you're a new member of staff, here's access? Or do you limit the amount of access to the amount of access that they need in order to perform their role? It's a very simple thing to do in order to reduce the amount of risk you're exposed to. How, as an organization, would you identify an attacker's presence on a network? So do you have something to look for, just an entirely fraudulent user, rather than an attack? And how do you separate devices and networks in order to ensure that the damage that can be done is limited in some way once somebody's in? And there's some good guidance on that from the NCSC. The third thing to consider, do you have an incident management plan? Now, this is not really about how do you respond in terms of IT. This is, look, if you're taken out and you lose 66 days of data, what are you going to do as a business in order to continue operating successfully? Now, this applies to any size business. If you're a small sole trader, you're likely to lose more data because you've got less protection. But it also probably affects you less, as long as you can, if you're a plumber, as long as you can get in your van, drive and fix a pipe, then you can continue to operate. Paradoxically, as you get larger, you get more secure, but you're also more greatly impacted by the loss of systems. You know, if you've got specializations, finance, HR and accounts, or sales, and any one of those gets taken out, what's the plan that you have in place to continue operating without those systems? The next thing here is about incident management plan. This is about having top-down key contacts, escalation routes, allocation of responsibility, and crucially, a no blame, no fault culture, where when you're working through an attack, are you open to feedback for the technical challenges, because they're going to be running through hypotheses, and do you have a business response that allows the technical resource to get on with what it needs to do, because it's a clearly defined responsibility, while you work to massage your organization through the challenges that they're faced with. And some good case studies on this from a Scandinavian lumber company a couple of years who went offline for 6 months. They had 45,000 employees globally, and they ended up bringing back somebody who'd retired 20 years ago to show them how to use filing cabinets and lever arch files. This is the sort of thing that should be considered. I'm not necessarily suggesting that every organization should have that kind of robustness built in. It wouldn't be necessary, but these are the questions. These are the important things to consider. Do you have an incident management plan that meets the particular challenges of an attack? So, are you aware of the specific types of attack, which is what the point of this webinar is? You should be thinking about ransomware as a service. What do you do when somebody's not really invested in damaging you, but they're going to do it anyway? What do you do about your home users whose kid's laptop or your partner's laptop was insecure, and you assumed that because yours was secure, it'd all be fine? You went on the same network and you got breached. And as a business, what are you doing to mitigate those risks? And then lastly, how's data backed up? And how confident are we that those backups wouldn't be affected by an attack or an infection? So rather than assuming, oh, don't worry, we've got backup, catch all for everything, it's like, have we got 2 years of backup? And then critically, do we respond to the backup duration? If we have backups for 3 months, are we prepared to lose 3 months of data? Because that's what's going to be at risk here. And those are the things that we should be sort of taking away and considering. So the next steps, I'm going to run this webinar again next week, and then we're going to move on to tracking dilemmas and behavioral modification. So this is what are you doing in terms of things on the internet that allow us to manipulate behavioral patterns, so to build a picture of you and then build threats around that. And then we're going to talk in a later webinar about zero trust principles. Now this is about reducing the amount of access to the bare minimum wherever that you possibly can do, and then building up from there. And on the last slide here, I've actually got the reference material itself, but I can share that with anybody who's interested. But that's me. If anybody's got any questions, can they pose them to Cassie or come forward and I'll take it away. Or type them into the chat window. So I'm picking up on Mark's question here about encouraging a good security culture. This goes back to my point about openness, no fault, no blame. Much of what you'll do in IT, and this is IT in general, not necessarily just cybersecurity, revolves around a process of hypothesis, and then you'll move from hypothesis to proving a hypothesis to writing an incident report and then progressing them from there. What you need to be able to do is make sure that there is time allowed for that to happen, and that as mistakes happen, that you can roll through them very quickly, because what you're trying to do is achieve an end goal, not worry about where somebody was wrong. And you should certainly presume that there'll be a degree of error in what's happening. Certainly in a cyber incident, you know, it's a fault that caused it in the first place. I'm just going to pick up Jack's question. Feel free, incidentally, to pop your video on and jump in and ask me this if you want to. So Jack's asking, ransomware attacks are moving away from encrypting files and more to exploiting employees. Can you give any more details on the changes in attack style? Yes. So I gave an example earlier. Don't know if you joined at this point, Jack, about sort of catching somebody online looking at pornography, switching their camera on. But then you haven't actually caught anybody doing anything. What you simply do is send them an email saying, I caught you doing this, and here's a password that I got a year ago from somewhere. The password proves providence and makes you think, oh God, they must have actually hacked my laptop, whereas in reality, you've done nothing of the sort. Another thing that we see, employees, so I've got a new job. I'm on LinkedIn, yay, tell everybody. And then you immediately get a phone call from the MD saying, oh, hey, good to hear. Have you got your company card yet? Yes, I've got my company card. Awesome. Would you mind popping to Tesco's and grabbing me some Amazon vouchers? Absolutely no problem, boss. I'm keen to impress. Runs down to the shop, comes back, gets a text message. Can you just text me the codes for that, please? I'm in a hurry. And immediately, however many pounds has left the company account, new person gets mud on their face. Now, it's crucial here. It kind of goes back to Mark's question. That's the kind of exploitation that we're seeing more and more. And what can you exploit? I mean, and you need a good culture around that in order to allow that employee not to feel like a complete fool. They're going to feel bad enough as it is, particularly on their first day. Something we're seeing a lot of now is quizzes. So free quizzes and free apps on phones. And these quizzes will ask you a whole load of questions and you get fully engaged and away you go. And before you know it, you've told them where you were born, what street you grew up on, what your favorite color is. And the following morning, somebody's in your bank account taking all your money. Now, that's not necessarily a demonstration of an employer risk, but it is the kind of risk that we're starting to see applied to employers. What can I find out about you that makes it really easy? Because the easiest thing in the world to do is not to break into your network, is to get somebody to let me in. That answers the question, Jack. Probably a few others. Anybody got anything else that they want to ask?
Charles.
Yes, Adrian.
You've got a mix of two sorts of people on this call. Obviously, some people working for Croft and some current clients. Yeah, give us an example from a sales viewpoint. 2 or 3 of your best wins and easiest wins in as least words as possible. Yeah? What's the majority fee, say, for 3 employees up to 15 employees? What's that word in those 2 lines that gets their attention? Selling by fear.
By fear. We've never onboarded a client who wasn't already breached.
Okay.
And the damage to that business, you haven't quantified. The challenge there is then saying to them, look, you are a moment away from disappearing at any given moment in time. And you're simply taking the view that because what you don't know won't hurt you. And it could be that somebody hasn't clicked a button yet.
Okay. So you're saying most of your clients have come after they've been breached?
No, I'm saying most businesses are in breach. Actually, the zero principle approach is that you should assume you're in breach all the time, because you typically are. It's the degree to which that's damaging you, and where ransomware is a real problem. What we would see normally traditionally would be this sort of massive investment in that we're going to get in, we're going to find out a lot of stuff, and we're going to jump up and down your supply chain. Whereas what we're seeing now is that we're going to get in, we're going to sit around for a bit, and then we're just going to burn the place down.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with nation state actors. China, Iran, Qatar, and Russia are the typical actors in this space. They're not. They're trying to damage us in terms of GDP, productivity as a nation. What they will do is they'll just row up in the same way Google's sets up some lists. Here's 100,000 people that were in. Can you get around to them, please? And somebody in the admin team will do, A to B on Monday, C to D on Tuesday, and so on. And you're just waiting to get taken out.
Yeah.
Mark, so the percentage does your average business underspend on cybersecurity? This varies a lot depending where you're at. Look, the UK and Europe as a whole are generally underinvested. The way I can quantify that is that the US, for instance, spend more than we do, and they have lower dwell time than we do. And you see the same thing in Asia Pacific region. So the more that people spend, the less time people are in their network before they do harm. And it's about £800 per head per annum is the last figure I had, but don't quote me on that. Has anybody else got anything? Or any follow-on questions from that?
Where do we stand today if somebody gets into your bank account and takes your money? What's the bank's view at the moment?
I can give you a better example, mortgage theft. So during last year, there was a spate of people impersonating the owner of a home in order to sell it to themselves. A legitimate transaction would go through, and then the owners would come back from holiday, knock on their door, and the house would have been sold to somebody else. And then they can't get their home back because a legitimate transaction has happened. It's gone through all of the processes and checks because the fraud was so convincing in the outset that they're now in a situation where they legitimately don't own their own home, but haven't had the benefit of the cash that they would have been paid.
Wow.
And there were 2 high-profile instances of that last year. And the NCSC, the UK, are only just gearing up to try and deal in a legal framework with that kind of risk. To answer your question about banks, I shan't name them, but there's a well-known high street bank who lots of small solicitors will send invoices using Word documents. It's very, very easy to go in and edit the sort code and account number. Sort code and account number gets edited before it leaves. Solicitor has no knowledge. Bank makes transfer to purchase property. Money disappears into another bank and nobody ever gets it back.
Wow.
We see this in supply chain subversion. So we have a client who trades internationally and they're heavily targeted. So, there's nothing you can do. There's massive resource gunning at them all the time. They take out fake domain names that look very similar to theirs. They will pose employees into an organization. And what they are looking to do is each time there is a 6-figure transfer made to an international supplier, they are looking to intercept that and send it somewhere else. And it's relatively easy. You just get in the middle of a conversation, pretend to be somebody else in the team, as long as that person's on holiday and nobody knows about it, away you go. And before you know it, 73,000 euros has gone somewhere it shouldn't. It's a massive risk. I'm just looking at the questions in the comments. So we talked about, I'm picking up Phil's question here, talked about businesses being dependent on single IT professionals. What's the best way for a small business to mitigate those risks? You need to demystify IT. So you need to be able to commoditize it as much as you can do. Take it into blocks and chunks and take control of it. It needs to be, we have written a policy that describes our risk. Professional, tell me what of that can manifest into IT policy and tell me what can't. And we'll accept that middle ground and then roll it out. If you can't get past one person in your organization, bring in external resource. This is like any other professional services sector. The more experience that you have, the greater your ability to respond. The more that you limit that experience, the more siloed you become, the less experience that you gain, because it sort of becomes a situation where the universe that you live in works in one way and you're not exposed to those challenges elsewhere. So it's the same thing that you do if you're a one-person law firm. You go and hire more lawyers or you'd bring in contractors, would be my take. Let me know, Phil, if that doesn't cover everything. Greg has asked, what part of business infrastructure do you typically see as the most vulnerable, most at risk? And does it change depending on the size or the entity? It's a really good question. It varies hugely. Risk here is how and this goes back to Phil's question actually. Risk here isn't how we would define what infrastructure is at risk. It's how do we, as a business, how do we define, what's really going to screw us up? And then what bit of IT software or hardware makes that happen? and then how do we protect it? And actually that conversation should be led not by an IT professional. It should be led in cohort with the IT professional, so that you can say, look, here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. So as you scale up, you take my plumber analogy earlier. The reality is if a plumber uses two years worth of their accounts data and payroll, they're probably not that bothered. They're probably not even bothered about losing, like electricians around here, their client list, because somebody will ring them, they'll see the side of the van, or they've already got their number and they're inundated with work. Where they're at risk is more the personal fraud element. Is somebody going to come in and steal all their money out of the bank? Are they going to take their house off them because they're bleeding information online? They're giving it out too freely. As soon as you start scaling past that, you're getting into, look, the most important person in my business is X. And how do we look after them, and how do we manage the risk around that? In terms of mitigation, the best way to do that is to have as uniform a deployment as you can do, to have the same infrastructure in as many places as possible, because you're reducing the number of things that people have to learn and understand and respond to, and it makes it easier for everybody else who isn't technical to get in on the conversation. If you just keep moving the goalposts all the time, nobody's keeping up. And actually a real bugbear of mine in the industry, technical, and you can't explain something to somebody who's non-technical, you're failing. Phil has asked, so as part of your service, you work with businesses to develop policies and processes so that risks are mitigated? Yeah, absolutely. It would be, you can parachute in a cyber solution. Does that respond to the business's risks? Well, the solution that we have broadly responds to the majority of the risks that I'm describing in this presentation. Does it respond to their specific risks? No. Does it take account of what should be their IT and information governance? Even if it isn't a policy, just their principles, like what's okay, what's not okay. Should we have, you've got to get into that conversation. I mean, a rule of thumb there with everybody is to say, if following an attack, you didn't make it more difficult for yourself, then you probably haven't responded to the attack. And it's that thought exercise that gets great alignment of not just IT and infrastructure, but software and process and productivity tools into a business. Does that answer the question, Phil? Awesome. Has anybody else that you want to throw at me? Anything from why do I need to change my password? It's probably because somebody's already got it. Through to any just bugbears or things that you find frustrating about getting online. Just wait for Anthony and Phil to type. Anthony, how secure are password managers? Infinitely more secure than the alternative. I appreciate that's not a direct answer, but secure. LastPass is our preference. Now, what we do with what LastPass does is when you install it, there's a lot of confusion around passwords and encryption. So what LastPass does is the password you enter when you set it up is actually the key that is then used to encrypt all of the passwords underneath. So if you lose that master password, you'll lose access to your passwords, but also if somebody stole it, they'd get in. And that's where multi-factor authentication comes in. Multi-factor authentication is absolutely crucial. It's a legal requirement in Australia and New Zealand now, and everybody should be using it. And it's something you know and something you have. I know my password, I have my phone. So even if somebody steals your password, they shouldn't be able to get in because they haven't got their phone as well. And that reduces the risk. So password managers, absolutely fantastic. As an organization, the way we do that is we actually have top-down management, so that rather than it's password sharing is a big one. So let's say I want to give somebody access to a system and we've only got one login. Through systems like LastPass, I can share my credentials with that user, but without the user getting either the username or the password. They simply get through the browser extension the ability to log in and log out. And that equally means that when I want to remove them from my system, and this is absolutely crucial, when somebody leaves your organization, you need to cut everything and you need to get them out fast, because maybe not that they have nefarious intent. If they did, they can exact a huge amount of damage on you. And it's important to note this is all criminal, but they can do it. But also if they lose those credentials or in any way at all, and password managers are allowing us to mitigate that risk, quite substantially. Phil's asking immediate risks to phone systems and connectivity endpoints and working from home networks. Actually, yeah, these are great. So when you put your phone system in, particularly VoIP. VoIP's like the thing at the moment, and SIP trunks. You are in fact just putting another endpoint onto your network. And when you put any endpoint onto your network, you should be considering well, a few things. The obvious is, are those endpoints secure? So software up to date. Is there a security policy that comes with them? And how are we locking them down? How do we isolate them? And that's very, very important. But if you don't do that, they can present a great risk. The biggest risk there is supply chain intervention, which is where you order a cheap telephone from China and the hack is in the phone. So as soon as you plug it into the network, there is a beachhead inside your organization and the hacker will move sideways from there and take everything else out. Thermostats at home, smart fridges. There was a point where IoT devices, smart devices, were sending out more. There was a fridge in South Korea got blocked for sending out like 500,000 spam emails a day, and it's because all the person saw was the fridge. They didn't see the Linux operating system, the full computer running behind it. There's no security. We see this with like smart vacuums and mops. You can hack the LiDAR antenna in order to pick up audio in the room, but I'm kind of getting into spy stuff there. Key thing, phone systems, connectivity and endpoints, always check and always reduce the amount of access to the minimum that's required for that deployment. And it's key. If you're going to put a new phone system in, have a conversation with a cybersecurity professional as you're doing it in order to, again, understand the risks. I'll move on to Chris's question. With more and more businesses adopting off-prem data storage and backup, if this were to be breached as the data sovereignty was with a third party, would they be liable for any GDPR breaches? Both parties typically will be liable in that situation. So if you have off-premise backup, there's data controllers and data processors. It's a commercial question, really. You would sign some sort of indemnity between the parties in order to recognize who held the greater responsibility commercially. Ultimately, the ICO would determine who was responsible for the breach. The bigger issue there is not to assume that because you've taken data into the cloud that it is inherently more secure. There are a lot of people purporting to sell cloud services that are not very different from what I did as a kid, which, I got my driving license like a lot of people at 17. So I'd rock up and say, look, you've got a really crap internet connection. I'll put your server in my boot. I'm going to drive it down to Bolton where I've got a 1 meg internet line because that's fast. Job done. Now, if that's all that's happening, you haven't improved anything other than the speed of the internet connection. And as you've improved the speed of the internet connection, you've improved the ability for the hacker to get at it, as well as yourself and your clients. So it's crucial, again, to sit and go, what's my perimeter? What's my risk and what's my risk appetite? And if you can't have that conversation with somebody, that's what I'm here for. Have that conversation with me. Chris, let me know if that doesn't answer your question directly. Karen is asking, following up with the password manager, if we're putting ourselves at risk if users are using freeware password managers, absolutely, don't use freeware ever or download free apps because they're always doing something. There's always an exchange there. Free password services, you like the Linux Foundation and freeware, there is real credibility in that. And there are freeware tools that are very secure, but trying to navigate that world is best left to IT professionals. So as a blanket rule for everybody else, if you're not paying for it, don't trust it. And I would say around apps, this is a big one. Apple only just recently introduced the ability to know if applications were tracking you outside of the application you thought. So Facebook would track your usage of your EasyJet boarding passes, your email use, your phone calls, your texts, because it's allowed to do that. And Apple have recently said, look, do you want to stop that? And you can opt out as it happens. That kind of tracking is really lucrative. TVs do it. HDMI 1 or the ARC cable on a TV looks at what you're playing, pausing, rewinding what you're watching, and then they sell that data, subsidize the TV. The same principles apply in cybersecurity. If you are using something that's free, there's probably an incentive, it might be commercially, to take that data or take other information that isn't necessarily the passwords, but you're freely giving away. And then if it's a criminal activity, why not give out free password managers? That's a really easy way. There was a big issue with this with there was the SolarWinds hack last year. That wasn't free, but they broke in and they used a legitimate tool in order to take control of lots of networks. These are the risks again. So be cynical. If it's free, avoid it and see if you can get a paid version. If you can't get a paid version, ask yourself why. That was a bit of a rant. I apologize, Karen. I hope that covers that. Anybody got anything else? give everybody a minute, and if there are no final questions, look, thank you very much for your time. I'll be doing the same talk next Thursday, which Cassie can confirm. So if you have follow-on questions, feel free to sort of jump in toward the end. It'll take me about 25 minutes to get through the first piece. And please do come along to the future webinars. I'm going to get off the talking about the risks and the update here, because I'll presume that they're relatively known. Start moving actually on to the best practice for how to establish risk, but actually without even doing that, how to just respond to it in the off. And that should be quite compelling. I'm just waiting away for Chris and Cassie now to ask any questions that they've got. Cassie, I'll just wait for you to finish typing. Super.
So I've just put in the link for any to do future webinars with us.
Fantastic. If nobody's got any final questions, thank you for taking up slightly less than an hour of your morning. I'm glad to have got it through in time. If you have any follow-on questions or anything you'd like to talk about one-on-one, if you pop through a message to us, I'll pick it up and I'll happily come on, and I'm very much a believer in my knowledge you can have for free, my experience you can pay me for. I'll help out with anything that we can do, and the team that we've got and is growing, and we'll be ready to sort of pick up and resolve anything that you need at all. Thank you all. Cheers.